Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our slow meander, our penguin waddle through my Penguin Classic wall, book by book, author by author, era by era, and what fun we've had so far. It's been 2 solid months of your Daily Penguin, and yesterday we did the King James Bible, which is the font of a massive amount of strength and wisdom and power in Western literature. Not talking here about its religious after effects, but in terms of literature, just a fountain of good things. And today, today we're talking about a work that is also a fountain, but it is, well, to use a rare word I mentioned the other day on this channel, and I complained about it specifically because there's hardly any opportunity to use it. This particular fountain is cloacal. It's a fountain of philosophy. Western philosophy in all of its endlessness. This is the Enneads by Plotinus, a 3rd century Neoplatonist who wrote these amorphous gas emissions and just kept writing them for his whole life because philosophers don't ever stop doing this sort of thing. And it's insufferable, it's unbearable, and it gave rise to pretty much all of Western philosophy. Certainly anything that can trace its roots to the Renaissance can trace its roots to this book. And all of it is flapdoodle. All of it is, just like the whole of the so-called discipline of philosophy is flapdoodle. It's endless verbiage about nothing and the nothingness of nothing. And the quintessential elements of the nothingness of nothing, and so on and so forth, with an absolutely errant worthlessness that is never called on the carpet because it is always supported by the endless supply of pretentious old people and young people who yearn someday to be pretentious. So that you have relatively smart, relatively educated writers wasting 500 pages, because a philosopher can't blow his nose without producing 500 pages, not on sunsets, but on the sunsetness of sunsets. An utterly wasted genre, an utterly worthless intellectual endeavor. Not one single of the Regency romances on the bookcase right next to me is worth less than the whole of the philosophic tradition. You take all of it, starting with Plotinus and going all the way forward. 2,000 years of this crap. Take it all, put it all on a barge, and weigh that barge against one Regency romance. There's more worth in the romance than there is in all the rest of this endless gumming about concepts and the conceptness of concepts and whatnot and derivatives of that. And I'm going to take this intangible thing that any child can tell you about. I'm going to break it into 10 different other sub-intangible things, and I'm going to write about them endlessly as if they mattered. And I'm creating this alternate reality and this weird, cumbersome alternate vocabulary to describe that alternate reality, and I'm being very precise about it. So I'll make sure that my disciples don't ever misuse my terminology, and they will make sure that their disciples don't, and so on and so forth. And a lot of that, I mean, in Neoplatonism, as you can tell from the name, comes from the works of Plato and Aristotle, and also Plotinus mixes in a huge amount of proto-Christian mysticism. But you might think from all of that, from my disdain for the whole subgenre of philosophy is well known, it's well documented, it's all junk. It's a total waste of your time to read. My God, is it a waste of your time to participate in or propound. You should never write it. But you might think that since my disdain of so-called formal philosophy is so well known, and since this book is the fons et origo of so much of that formal philosophy, I think that this is not a recommend. But it is. This is a recommend. Not for the work, but for the translation. I've talked many times in the course of our March of the Penguins about the vagaries of translation when it comes to what Penguin Classics as a publisher can and cannot do. There'll be translations that they don't have access to, that are recognized as brilliant, but that they don't have access to. Or they might have access to those translations, but the market will only support so much. You can't have 15 Iliads, right? Even if you admit that 15 different translations of the Iliad have been brilliant. And sometimes that results in market omissions. We don't have Florio Montaigne, for instance, for Penguin. There's a beautiful, wonderful collected essays of Montaigne in the Penguin Classic Library. We're going to get to it. Not that long from now. We will be getting to it. And it's a modern translation, and it's a modern scholar with modern annotations. And that's all well and good. And maybe you would hand that to somebody who didn't know anything about Montaigne at all. But there's something to be said for classic translations as well, in their own right, apart from keeping up with scholarship. Same thing with the North Plutarch, or even the Dryden Plutarch. Penguin does neither one of them. I believe that the rights to, for instance, the Shehini Beowulf goes elsewhere. It does not go to Penguin Classic. I'm pretty sure that Penguin Classic's translation of Beowulf is somebody else. You will get in Penguin, we have seen the Fagel's Oresteia, the Robert Fitzgerald Aeneid. Those are very classic. Those are classic, very interesting translations. But Penguin, for instance, doesn't do the Robert Fitzgerald Homer. And so on and so forth. You see what I mean. You get my point. That I've showed you just the other day. We were talking about Jason and the Argonauts, the Argonautica, and I showed you the Peter Green translation, which is much better than the translation that Penguin actually uses. For any number of financial or copyright reasons, they just might not have access to that translation. But every once in a while, they get a great one. They get a great one, and that is true here. This translation is by an Irishman from the turn of the 20th century called Stephen McKenna, who was a knockabout journalist, horrible spendthrift, an endlessly reliable friend and conversation mate. He never lost a friend, and his conversation was golden. In fact, there were many occasions in many of the ramshackle houses and apartments that he had throughout his life, with books on every flat surface, with books piled neatly on the floor. He knew exactly where everything was. There were many instances in the late 19th century and early 20th century where guests coming over for a Spartan meal and conversation would comment in their own journals and in their own autobiographies after the fact how much they wished that a stenographer had been present. They didn't know anything about tape recorders. How much they wished that a stenographer had been present to catch it all, because of how brilliant McKenna was and how much brilliance he evoked in others. But most of his early life was poor, was plagued by poverty. He turned that around a little when he married a sensible woman who started to look after his finances, and also to make him a little more conscious of, do you need to spend, you just got 30 pounds. Do you need to spend all of it on books? You don't have any food. You can see through your clothing. Maybe not do that. So those sorts of decisions he started to make when he married. And then his life turned around completely in a way that a more sensible person, the Irish and money, I could go on. I could go on and on about the Irish and money. He got an opportunity by Pulitzer, the Pulitzer, the guy. There's a mention of it here in the introduction. I'm never going to find it now, but anyway, Joseph Pulitzer, his paper, The World, needed a correspondent, and Stephen McKenna had impressed him and impressed people that he knew, and he gave the job to McKenna and gave him an office in Paris and a secretary and an expense account. The sort of thing he'd never had before, any even close to it. You would think, in the normal course of events with a normal person, that he would have retired in that job after 50 years. But no, no, because it just wasn't meant to be. It just wasn't his temperament. It wasn't hurt by the fact that Pulitzer was a tin-plated, card-carrying a-hole. And at one point, Pulitzer just high-handedly ordered McKenna to do an errand, basically, an errand. It had nothing to do with his job. It was, I need you to bring parcel A over to place B and do it now. It wasn't part of McKenna's job. It wasn't anything connected with his specialty, which was writing, deadline writing. He was fantastic at deadline writing and did it all the time. Constantly had stuff, little jobs coming in. Naturally, he bridled. Anybody would bridle. He wasn't a slave. He wasn't a toady at all. He didn't have that kind of temperament. And I guess if you're Joseph Pulitzer, you probably think that everybody does. But one way or another, McKenna quit. He quit the job and went back to his rack of rent, knockabout world of getting work when you can, freelance work and whatnot. But he went to Russia. At one point, he went to St. Petersburg and fell in love with Plotinus. Came across an Oxford copy of Plotinus and fell in love and wanted to translate him. He was busy with journalistic procedures while he was in Russia. He interviewed Tolstoy. But he also turned out a draft of Plotinus, a little sketch, just a sort of a calling card to the world of a way that you could translate this author. A very short piece, and it was published, and it came to the attention of a wealthy Englishman who wanted to see more of it, plain and simple. Just wanted to see more. Wrote to the author and said, "I want to see more of this. Why isn't there more of this? Are you considering? Excuse me. Are you considering translating all of Plotinus?" And McKenna, he kept a journal. He wrote voluminous letters. Kept a commonplace book, and the commonplace book and the journal and the letters are full of dreams, full of projects that he thought out, carefully wanted to do, and then never did. And you do enough of that. Some of you may have experience with this. If you do enough of that kind of dreaming, and you keep yourself away from the particular dopamine hit, the particular satisfaction of not just dreaming but getting things done, if you keep yourself away from that, because the only way you can experience that dopamine hit is to risk failing. If you only dream and don't do, you don't get that dopamine hit, but you also don't risk failing. And for some people, that is caution enough. He never did any of those things, and he became, after a while, afraid of doing those things, afraid of doing anything. The fear of failure far outweighed the pleasure of dreaming these projects up. And a complete translation of Plotinus was one of those projects. So he wrote back to this wealthy Englishman and said, "Well, I the pressure of work, that I work very slowly, I'm very exacting, it has to be perfect," all this sort of stuff to get out of committing. But the Englishman didn't let go. The Englishman didn't let go, kept forwarding him money, getting him publishing contracts, getting this thing, willing it, paying for it to come into the sunlight. And eventually, over the course of a long, long life of illness and unhappiness, lost his wife, lost his mother, lost job after job, never lost any friends, but never had any money to speak of. Never anything like that, the fat days of working for the world. Eventually, it happened. Eventually, McKenna actually did finish all of the Enneads. And they came out, the publisher that the Englishman had set up terms with, brought them out in a very ornate, expensive set. When the first volume came out, McKenna was not happy with it. Wasn't by then very happy with anything. He had an abscess tooth. You wouldn't believe. In the modern day, in 2020, you wouldn't believe how that can overshadow your life because it's 20 minutes to fix. But if you don't have access to dentistry, it's not 20 minutes to fix. It's your whole life. But anyway, he saw what this was like, and it immediately started talking about the common people. What he was talking about was himself. He was easily remembering the many, many years of his own life when if he'd walked into a Dublin bookstore and seen a pristine and beautiful new translation of Plotinus that was set up in such an edition, he wouldn't have been able to afford it at all. Would have had to look at it, but not afford it. And it did well with critics. Critics liked that edition. They recognized right away that it was special, but it didn't reach a reading populace. It couldn't possibly have reached a reading populace. And the subsequent volumes the same way. So that by the time they were done, one or two discriminating critics in the English-speaking world could say that the Stephen McKenna translation of Plotinus was a great translation. Not just of Plotinus, but it was one of the great translations of the English language, like the Florio-Montaigne, like the North Plutarch. And Penguin, bless their hearts, somebody at Penguin had to remember that and had to go and find it. And it turns out, of course, it wasn't that hard to find. And here it is. This is not all of it. Once again, I could complain. It's amazing to me that I'm asking for more of this kind of quasi-philosophical, navel-gazing claptrap. But when it comes to this translation, that is what I'm asking. I wish this were the complete McKenna Plotinus. I'm glad that it's here. Absolutely glad that it's here. Glad that this volume has a life, because it deserves it. I wish in an ideal world this would be a Penguin Classic 3 times the size that would be called The Collected Stephen McKenna. And it would include all the pamphlets that he wrote about Irish revolutionaries, all the criticism, all the journalism that's really good that he wrote, anything longer that he wrote, his ruminations on translating Plotinus, and all of his Plotinus, all in one big fat volume. I would love that. Really, really love that. But for now, this is actually a recommend. Even though I don't recommend the work at all, I recommend the translation. Enough to compensate for that. You should not be wasting any of your reading time on philosophy. You just shouldn't. There are so many other things to read that actually do something, mean something, and are something. This is just the blabber of a 3-year-old. You know, when your 3-year-old gets to that point where they suddenly know what English is, they know that they can talk. They know now. They suddenly start to realize what words are, and what comes out of them is just blabber. It's just blabber. It's just them figuring out everything, and that's what this is. So but nevertheless, for the translation, I want to recommend it. I want to read you a bit of the McKenna Plotinus in order to underscore for you how many times throughout this translation our author's own knockabout life comes to the surface. One of the magics of great translations is that the translator is not only speaking directly to the author, they're also writing about themselves in a marvelous way. I want to read just a bit of this. Too much Plotinus on a Tuesday is bad. The soul, and the soul is with a capital S, of course. The soul watches the ceaselessly changing universe and follows all the fate of all its works. This is its life, and it knows no respite from this care, but is ever laboring to bring about perfection, planning to lead all to an unending state of excellence, like a farmer first sowing and planting, then constantly setting to rights where rainstorms and long frosts and high gales have played havoc. Now, not only is that lovely English, of a type that I maintain a more modern translator of Plotinus would not give you. Not only is that lovely English, did you hear that rolling cadence, just wonderful, and that runs throughout this translation. There's also a fairly good little glimpse into Stephen McKenna's life as soul, gardening and watching the universe with ceaseless care, whether it wants to or not. But I want to read you something else, too. A little bit here in the introductory sketch. There's an introductory sketch by John Dillon of McKenna's life. The introductory sketch of this volume is very long on McKenna and very short on Plotinus. And I want to read you just a bit. This is from a journal entry that he did in 1907 when he was 30. Reflecting just a bit on his journalism career versus the higher and more pure writing that he wanted to devote his life to. This is from March of 1907. Listen to this. There is something high fantastical in the thought that if every day of my life I had a good hot piece of gossip about some millionaire fool or some powerful businessman at play to cable to New York, I should be well off and considered from New Year to Christmas. But if I put comely English about Plotinus and give him for the first time, perhaps for all time, entire and clear and pleasantly readable to America and Australia and England, I shall certainly go about in old clothes and shrink from facing a post office clerk. When I did very little, and that better left wholly undone, I was fatted bourgeois. Work begins only when the dear little checks that paid me for an ugly idleness cease to flutter in. Unless there's something seriously wrong with you, you would rather read 600 pages of that than 600 pages of Plotinus, even translated by that. What I wouldn't give if this volume were the journals and commonplace books of Stephen McKenna. What I wouldn't give. But I will take this. I will take this, and so should you. So your Penguin Classic for today is weird quantum superposition between recommend and condemn, because Neoplatonism and all philosophy is absolute garbage, a complete waste of your time. One of the only kinds of reading that is a complete waste of your time. But I nevertheless recommend this particular edition of Plotinus. So, what are you going to do? I am a confusing guide, I admit. So we So Monday, we did a vast compendium of literature that was wonderful. And Tuesday, we're doing a vast compendium of, I guess you could call it literature, that is itself a source of enormous amounts of time wasting and BS. It's wonderful in its way, but it forms a counterpoint to the King James Bible. So I'm thinking that it's best for Wednesday's Penguin. We dispense with literature altogether. How about that? How about we even the keel by dispensing with literature altogether? That's what we'll do tomorrow. So I will see you then. Thank you, Book 2.